everyone, welcome back to my channel and to the first reading wrap-up of 2023. Grab something warm to drink, maybe cozy up with a blanket, and we are going to be covering the first 3 months of the year and my reading. So I typically read 2 to 5 books a month, which I don't really feel like is quite enough books to cover in a video. So I decided to kind of break out the year by quarter. In the first quarter of the year, winter 2023, I read 17 books. That's 7 in print, 2 in digital, and 8 in audio format. Let's get into it. I started this year reading the first 2 books in the Young Elite series by Marie Lu. That was the Young Elites and then the Rose Society. I loved Marie Lu's books when I was a teenager, and I thought that starting this year on a couple of YA books would really just help kind of keep my pace at a solid, clip, because I tend to just gobble up YA books really quickly. So the premise of the books is that there is a plague that sort of sweeps through a country, and the children who survive are marked with visible sort of signs of their survival. Some of those children have magical powers as well, and they're really wide-ranging. It's not like sort of a standardized magic system, but rather somebody can talk to animals here and somebody can become invisible there. Our main character is a young girl who has been abused by her father and is running away from home. As she tries to make her escape, she kind of stumbles into powers that she didn't know that she had. And for the rest of the book, we see her trying to survive in the world on her own and understanding these strange powers that she has. The setting is kind of like a magical Venice. There are sort of lots of masks and cultural markers that suggest it's similar to Venice, with, of course, some fantasy twists. For example, there are these creatures that are kind of like giant stingrays that fly through the sky. The first book in this series was fun. We got, training montages, a secret society, a fascinating and mysterious love interest. But I did find that the second book was really disappointing in comparison. The main character is somebody who's clearly grappling with a lot of trauma, but she just is a very, very dark main character who really chooses cruelty pretty often. And I just don't really find myself very interested in seeing where her character arc ends. I wasn't loving the way the second book was paced. I wasn't really loving her character non-growth. And I found myself being pretty disappointed with the second book. So I don't think I'll really bother finishing the trilogy. Overall, I gave the first book a 3.75 stars and the second book a 2.75 stars. The next book I read was The German Wife by Kelly Reamer. Reamer. The German Wife is a fantastic book. It was my first 5-star read of the year, and I would highly recommend the audiobook, which is how I read it. It is historical fiction that follows 2 women through the 1930s to the 1950s. One is a young German mother and wife named Sophie, and the other is a farmhand turned wife named Lizzie from Texas. It looks at the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany and really examines how everyday people who were opposed to Nazi politics were, in many ways sucked into that larger political dynamic, the ways that families were threatened, and the real horrifying bind that people found themselves in. And then also grapples with, well, does that matter, right? If at the end of the day you were participating in a system that was this harmful, how do you reckon with that? And kind of in the end of the book concludes with the family of Sophie Rhodes coming to America as part of the Manhattan Project. Her husband, who had been a Nazi scientist working in the rocket program, was recruited to the US and given amnesty to work as a scientist for NASA. For Lizzie, she lives through the Great Depression and sees the impact that has on her farming family. And then her brother goes off to fight in World War II, and he comes home deeply traumatized and without really appropriate resources to manage that pain. And so we see the impact of the war from 2 very, very different perspectives of these 2 women, Lizzie and Sophie, who are now by the 1950s living together in the same community in Huntsville, Alabama. It's heart-wrenching, it's really, really thoughtful and earnest, and I think it is a great example of how fiction can really widen the scope of the empathy that we offer each other. Next, I read Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo, which was one of my most anticipated books of the year. I read 9,000 when it was first released and really loved it, even though it is a rather dark story, and this sequel really lived up to my hopes. I will say 9,000 is a really complicated book. I highly recommend looking up a summary of what happened in that first book, because no time is taken to like catch you up to speed in this book, and if you, like me, read that book like 3 years ago, you're gonna be a little confused. The original premise of the books is a young girl named Alex Stern is given a second chance at life at Yale University, working for a secret society that sort of polices magic use on campus. She comes from a really challenging background and has lived through a lot of trauma, and has the ability to see ghosts. And so that is kind of her asset to this secret society. Both books kind of operate as like a murder mystery series, kind of. Like that's the sort of plot device that carries us through the story, but there are a lot of layers going on in between. And this book picks up right where the last book ended, and it takes us literally all the way to hell. So it was quite the ride. I loved it and gave it 4.5 stars. Next, I read Spare by Prince Harry, which is a memoir about his life, and I highly recommend it on audio because he does read the book on audio. I will say this book was just really sad. It's got moments of levity. It offers lots of insight into his life that I was certainly not privy to before, and I think it is a really scathing look at how the media hounds celebrities, and in particular the monarchy, as well as a pretty scathing look at the monarchy itself as a system that really fails to provide its participants with human rights in many ways. I am not a UK citizen, so my interest in the monarchy and the royals is a very like distanced and low stakes opinion, right? I liked the book. I would recommend it to folks who are interested in his life, in what the loss of a mother can do to a child, in examining the relationship between celebrity and press. And I will say, I think if you want some like more valuable takeaways on the book, I highly recommend Lena Norm's review of this book, which was really well done. So I'll link that below. Okay, we're losing daylight. I turned on a lamp. I don't know if that's gonna help anything, but we will just keep trucking along. So the next books I read were A Psalm for the Wild Built and Prayer for the Crown Shy by Becky Chambers. These books are called the Monk and Robot series, and they are absolutely astounding little books. I think they might technically count as novellas. They're very short. These books are classic Becky Chambers cozy sci-fi. They're set on an Earth in the far future after an industrial age where we, damaged the climate of Earth. Many people on Earth fled to the skies and to space, and the people who stayed behind really had to rebuild and restructure society. We follow two main characters in this. The first of those characters is a tea monk, which is like my new dream job. And basically the idea is that a tea monk is a religious leader who sets up a tea shop in a community and just makes space for somebody to come and talk about their problems and be made a cup of tea, really just to be heard and to be offered grace and space to feel all your feelings. So like, just an incredible job. And I should add, like in many Becky Chambers books, we see both gender and sexuality queered in many ways. So in this case, our tea monk is non-binary. There is no gender used to refer to them throughout the story, which I think is really always great representation. The other main character we follow is a robot, a sentient robot, who has been living in the woods. So during the industrial age, a long time ago, all of the robots became sentient and they just kind of like up and left, and humans agreed to like let them go live their lives. So no human and robot have met in hundreds of years, but our two characters happen to meet in the woods. And so the first book really follows their journey through the woods, while our team monk Dex is on a bit of a self-discovery mission. And then in the second book, we really follow them back in the human world as the robot named Mosscap is getting introduced to human society and learning all about people. It is just one of my new favorite book series. I have recommended it widely already and gave both books 5 stars. If you are looking for something that feels like a hug in a book, I recommend you pick these up. Next, I read The Witch's Heart by Genevieve Gornichek. This book is a book of Norse mythology following Angrboda, who was one of the first witches in Norse mythology and also the wife of Loki, who you probably know of from the many, many Marvel uses of that sort of character and myth. It is an incredibly fast-paced book with just like knockout banter. It has such witty, quippy writing, and it covers an incredible span of time. I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was a fun use of the mythology retelling genre. I read a lot of books in the mythology retelling genre, and I really loved being introduced to a lot of things in Norse mythology that I just really wasn't familiar with to begin with. This book literally made me laugh and definitely almost made me cry. So I highly recommend it, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Next, I read Becoming Free Indeed, My Story of Disentangling Faith from Fear by Ginger Duggar Vulo. I don't know if any of you grew up in a house that watched a lot of TLC, but I definitely watched a lot of TLC when I was growing up. Looking back on all of that, I have questions about like most of the shows that they produced. But in particular, I followed a lot of the Duggar family's story and then continued to follow their family in the news when their eldest son was arrested and charged and convicted of having child pornography, as well as the many allegations that were made of him harming his own sisters when he was younger. I'm also really interested in cults and cult-like behavior, and certainly as an adult looking back on the Duggar family and the way that they happen to practice their faith, it certainly had a lot of the markers of a cult that I would look for. I highly recommend Cultish by Amanda Montell. If you haven't read it, it talks a lot about the language of cults and the way that they operate. Anyway, this book is one of the elder daughters in that family talking about how she came to terms with the cult-like behavior of that upbringing and did the work of deprogramming is not a word that she would use, but I would say deprogramming herself and coming to have a new and healthier relationship to her faith. In particular, she emphasizes that a lot of people who grow up in that kind of really conservative environment choose to leave religion altogether. And she really wants to offer people an alternative and offer her story on how she came to maintain a faith in God while really removing herself from some of the more harmful practices and beliefs that she had grown up with. This story wasn't for me. It's written for people with experiences like hers. But what really struck me about the book is how textbook her experiences of leaving that cult-like environment were. We know that changing people's minds does not start with ridicule or shame. It starts when somebody you love offers gentle perspective over time without judgment. And in Ginger's case, it was some of the men who married into her family who came from very faithful households, but that practiced faith differently than hers, that she was introduced to some of the ideas that she has now incorporated into her own practice of faith. I think that this book could be a really important tool for lots of people who are in a position like she was. And so while I didn't find it particularly affecting personally as somebody who hasn't lived through that experience, but also somebody who doesn't share that faith, I do think that her writing this book is really important. and I'm really glad that I had the chance to read it and to understand that perspective a little bit better. I gave the book 3.5 stars. Next, I finished the Wayfarer series by Becky Chambers by reading A Record of the Spaceborn Few and The Galaxy and the Ground Within. To start with A Record of a Spaceborn Few, I tried first reading this book back in probably October of last year and found that I had to put it down. It has a massive cast of characters, and so while it has a lot of the hallmarks of a Becky Chambers book that I love, I did find it really hard to get into the book the first time around. I revisited it back in February and kind of just pushed through, gave myself a little bit of patience as I learned who everybody was in the story, and I found that I really did enjoy it. So this book really looks at how humans have approached life in space. When Earth failed in the Becky Chambers universe, some people stayed and tried to fix it, but most people left. Many went to colonies on Mars or on the moon, and when humans were accepted into the sort of like galactic body politic, many then also went on to live on other planets. But I would say like the majority of humans live on the Exodus fleet, which are these spaceships where they all live as if it were basically a planet. And it just follows people from very different walks of life and imagines like how we would live if we had to live on this Exodus fleet. So we follow a caretaker who is somebody who manages the bodies of the dead on the ship, which are composted and used for clean air. We follow a young mother with 2 children and trying to raise them in the aftermath of a really frightening event in the fleet when they were small. It follows somebody who was living planetside and then visits the Exodus fleet, and many, many other people. So many people. Oh, and it follows an archivist whose job it is to record human history on the Exodus fleet. A plot kind of does emerge over time, but this is not a plot-driven story by any means. The 4th and final book in the Wayfarer series, The Galaxy and the Ground Within, follows a handful of travelers on a sort of forgotten stop-along planet as their travel plans get delayed and trap them unexpectedly in this kind of desolate nowhere place. It's a story about understanding difference, respectfully interacting with strangers, offering curiosity and patience to one another, but it also explores some of the larger political issues that have been sort of touched on throughout the book. So we have characters who have been exiled from their home, characters who have been, whose planets have been destroyed, and who have to live on spaceships because they do not have a home. And we also get to see little glimpses of like alien species practices and lifestyles that are again hinted at in other books. Again, this book is not super like plot forward. It really is much more just about the people in the story and the very like human experiences of characters who are not human at all. There are no humans in this book. But again, it's just written in the voice of Becky Chambers, which is so comforting and so like brightly curious. And I did enjoy both of the books in the end, although they were my least favorite, I would say, of the Becky Chambers books that I've read. So both got a 4.25 stars. Next, I read The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandana. I think that's how you say her name. I loved this book. It does kind of have like House on the Cerulean Sea vibes from just the perspective of telling a really heartwarming story that centers on adults but features lots of really hilarious magical children. The basic premise of the book is that our main character is a witch. Witches aren't supposed to gather or convene and be with other witches because it sort of draws too much magic to one space and it could be kind of uncontrollable and it could expose witches to society. Another premise of the world is that witches are always orphaned, and so between not being able to be with other witches and always being an orphan, these witches just live very isolated and lonely lives. Our main character pretends to be a witch online and gets recruited to teach 3 young witches who are being raised by regular old people who have no idea what they're doing. And so she moves to this place called Nowhere House and gets a tutoring job with these young girls, and along the way she really falls in love with the larger family caring for these girls and has a particularly interesting romance with the sort of grumpy librarian who's been tutoring the girls in all things that aren't about magic. This book gave me butterflies, it made me laugh, and it was just a really heartwarming story. I gave it a 4.75 stars. Next, I read To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers, which is a novella, which I believe is also set in sort of her larger universe. It is a much more near future story, and it's about these 4 genetically altered astronauts doing some of humans' first major space exploration. I recapped this book and the next one I'm going to tell you about in my most recent reading vlog, so if you want my more in-depth thoughts on this book, you can check that out. I would say in summary, it was a good, interesting book that had a lot of the things about Becky Chambers' writing that I love, but it was not my favorite. I gave it 3.75 stars. I also read Foundryside by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is a fantasy heist story that follows a young thief who is in over her head when a job goes wrong. It involves a magic system called scriving, which is basically magically coding objects into believing that they are or can do something other than they already could do. It was a great time. It was fast-paced, it had excellent characters, and is setting up for, I think, a larger conflict that I am really eager to dive into. So I really enjoyed the book, I would recommend it, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Most recently, I've been reading the Legondborn series by Tracy Deonn. The first book is Legondborn, and the second book is Bloodmarked. I have completed Legondborn. I loved it. It follows a young Black girl who is in an early college program at the University of North Carolina. And in her time there, she discovers a secret society that's all about sort of Arthurian legend and demon hunting. And she gets really wrapped up in that society because she thinks that they're involved in the death of her mother. This book is all about grief and racism and the, horrors that often underpin the people who hold power today, right? And like how they came to acquire that power. And it has something that I don't think I've heard as many people talking about, really excellent variety in magic systems. So we first learn about magic through the perspective of this secret society that's like obsessed with King Arthur, but then we also learn about another kind of magic system in the world that takes a very different approach to the use of magic. And so we see this main character who is kind of at the intersection of different identities and different power systems and magic systems. And we just see her grapple with that in a really interesting and compelling way. These books are so fast, like constantly one action scene to another. The only reason this isn't a 5-star book for me is that the romance at the center of it moves a little too quickly, which is very typical of YA books, but as in many fantasy books, it does involve sort of like, there is an opportunity to sort of bond yourself to somebody else. And just like signing up to bond yourself to some boy you fell in love with 5 days ago makes me uncomfy. So aside from the very quick moving romance, this was just an absolute epic and I loved it to bits and pieces. It got a 4.75 stars from me. I'm currently finishing Bloodmarked, and by the time March ends, I will have finished this book. This book is shaping up to be just as good as the first. I'm really loving it and I expect that I will give it a similar rating. I highly recommend these books. They are just so fun while also being really, really, I think, meaningful and impactful and incorporating perspective that we just don't have centered enough in fantasy writing. Last but not least is When I Dare to Be Powerful by Audre Lorde. This is a part of the Penguin Great Ideas series, and I just love these like teeny tiny books. They're like 100 pages long. And they introduce you to some of the key ideas of major thinkers from different time periods. I have really loved this book. I'm not done with it yet. I will be by the time April rolls around. But it's just filled with such compelling essays from Audre Lorde, who was also a poet, so they're written beautifully. Just to give you a sense of the essays that are included in this, it includes The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action, An Open Letter to Mary Daly, Eye to Eye, Black Women, Hatred and Anger, Age, Race, Class, and Sex, Women Redefining Difference, and Scratching the Surface, Some Notes on the Barriers to Loving and Women. There are 2 others, Poetry is Not a Luxury and Uses of the Erotic. I had to read some of these essays when I was a student in school, but I haven't extensively read Audre Lorde's works, so I've really loved kind of getting to dive into the issues she thought was so important and hearing her perspective on different issues. It is remarkable reading the words that she had to say in like the 1980s and feeling them be so resonant still today. So those are the books that have occupied my brain space and reading time for the last 3 months. I'd love to know what you were reading this winter and welcome you to stick around and check out whatever comes next. Let me know what you've been reading and what you're excited about this spring. I know I have a lot of books that I am very eager to dive into this spring, and we'll be sure to keep you all posted here on what I'm reading next. Have a good one.